introduction to academic writing and Module 1, Parallelism. In all writing, not just academic writing, to read means to interpret. To listen means to interpret. We always interpret our communication. This interpretation is unavoidable as we are human beings, not computers. Because we each have different backgrounds, experiences, and educations, we can each interpret the text differently. Obviously, multiple different interpretations is a problem because when you write something, you want everyone to understand it the way you meant for it to be understood. So you want to write unambiguously. You want to limit the ways that readers can interpret your text. To achieve this, you need to write clearly and concisely. But how do you write clearly and concisely? That is vague advice. In these modules, we're going to learn some basic principles that will help you to write clearly and concisely. Each principle I will explain to you works because of one fact. Readers have expectations. You have expectations when you read a text, though you're probably not aware of most of them. You have expectations about how information is linked together, about how sentences are structured, and about where information is placed within a sentence and within a paragraph. We all have the same expectations. When our expectations are met, we read easily and quickly through a text, quickly grasping the main ideas. When our expectations are unmet, we find ourselves stopping and rereading what we just read. We feel confused, and we ask ourselves, what are they trying to say here? Or, did I miss something? And then we start to interpret more liberally because we don't really know what the writer intended. Our goal in writing clearly is to give the reader what they expect. I will go so far as to say that the reader should be able to read without stopping. So if someone has to stop and go back when reading your text, it's a sign that something is wrong. You can get great feedback from your colleagues outside your field, even if they don't know so much about writing, by simply asking them to read your text and mark every place that they have to stop and reread. In the beginning, you won't know exactly what is wrong in those places, but through these modules and through working together, you'll start to be able to identify what the problem is and come up with possible solutions. Now, let's get started. The first module is about parallelism. First of all, what is parallelism? The dictionary definition goes like this: the use of successive verbal constructions in poetry or prose which correspond in grammatical structure, sound, meter, meaning, etc. I don't know about you, but I don't always find dictionary definitions the easiest to understand. There might be some specific words in this definition that you might not be familiar with. For example, did you know that prose is simply any text that you've written that doesn't rhyme? And what are successive verbal constructions exactly? Let me try to explain it to you more simply. Do you remember what parallel lines were in math class from when you were young? Two corresponding lines that would never intersect? Well, in writing, we can imagine our sentences, or parts of our sentences, on parallel lines. And we want to imagine that the structure of each part of the sentence that is on the parallel line matches up. So I could say that parallelism is using the same structure within a sentence or between sentences, or repeating the same words or the same type of word or the same structure of the sentence. When I say type of word, I mean repeating verbs in the past tense or repeating a singular noun. That's what type of word refers to. Now, the thing about parallelism is that it needs to be used all the time. Readers expect sentences to be parallel. And native speakers of English, they use parallelism constantly and without thought. Unparalleled sentences are not usually ever formed in an English native speaker's mind. This is how strongly parallelism is encoded into the DNA of English. In my experience, it is not as strongly encoded in some other languages. Though, if you become aware of what parallelism is and how it can be used, it usually benefits your other languages as well. Let's look at some examples. The first example comes from John F. Kennedy. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Notice the first part of the sentence ends at the semicolon, and I've placed the second part of the sentence on a parallel line right underneath the first one, so you can see how the structure matches up. Notice the ask and ask at the beginning, the what, and the can do for. Notice how your country and you are basically inverted between the two lines. And there's one word that exists in the first part of the sentence that does not exist in the second part of the sentence. That word is not. And because that's a difference, our eye is immediately drawn to it. Here's another example by Daniel Gilbert. There are at least two ways in which brains might be said to make future, one of which we share with many other animals, the other of which we share with none. Notice that one matches up with the other. Notice the repetition of which we share with, and then we can very easily see the difference between many other animals and none. So here you see that parallelism can be used to show contrast. The structure remains the same, and the eye is naturally drawn to the differing words, so the contrast is emphasized. Here's another example. It starts with a little introduction. The competence motivation theory assumes that, and then there's going to be a sub-sentence that's going to be our main parallel sentence. There are two groups in this research, two groups of children. The first group is children with high perceived competence. And the sentence goes, children with high perceived competence in a specific domain are intrinsically motivated to participate in this specific domain while, there's the contrasting word, while, children with low perceived competence are less motivated. Notice the parallel naming of the two groups. The only difference there is high versus low. Notice the parallel structure of the verbs, are intrinsically motivated versus are less motivated. And notice how the extra information in the sentence did not need to be repeated. The phrases in a specific domain and to participate in this specific domain automatically apply to the second group because the sentence is written in parallel format. Let's look at another example. This is an example from medicine. The first part of the sentence goes, we administered 10 milligrams of this drug intravenously. And the second part of the sentence goes, followed by CT scanning 72 hours after administration. In this sentence, there's one action in the first part. We administered, there's the verb. And we can't really see what is going on in the second part. There's no verb, which means there's no action. Is there an action in the second part? It's unclear because the action that's happening is hiding in a noun, CT scanning. And the format is not parallel, which if you have two actions happening in a sentence, you would expect those actions to be presented in parallel form. The other problem with this sentence is you have repetition. It's a bit wordy because we're missing parallel format. You've got the phrase followed by and also after administration. Those both tell you when something happened, so you don't need both of them. Having both of them is redundant. If we try to rewrite this sentence using parallelism, then we'll first find the thing that is happening in the second part, and we'll make it a verb in the past tense to match the structure of the first part. So the first part was we administered 10 milligrams of this drug intravenously. And if we change the second part of the sentence, can you figure it out? If I give you a few seconds, what should the verb be? What happened in the second part? Then performed a CT scan 72 hours later. We've simply chosen a verb in the past tense that tells me what we did with the CT scan. And now we have the structure: subject, we; verb, administered; object, 10 milligrams of this drug. And in the second part, subject, again we; verb, performed; object, a CT scan. And we see very clearly what's happening in both parts of the sentence. You've seen examples of how parallelism can be used within a single sentence to list, contrast, and emphasize. Now let's look at how parallelism can be used in paragraphs to help the reader pick out the information most quickly. This is especially relevant when you have to present the same kind of information about multiple groups. The first paragraph in this research article is about how they measured autonomy. The second is about how they measured opportunities for professional development. Autonomy was assessed with a 3-item scale based on CareSX job content instrument. A sample item is, I can decide for myself how I execute my work. All items were scored on a 5-point scale ranging from 1 never to 5 always. Opportunities for professional development were assessed with 3 items from the scale of Bakker, Demaruti, Tarish, Schaufeli, and Schreurs. A sample item is, I have sufficient possibilities to develop myself at work. All items were scored on a 5-point scale ranging from 1, totally disagree, to 5, totally agree. Now, the parallelism in these paragraphs is that each paragraph is structured in the same way. The first sentence gives you the instrument that was measured, autonomy and opportunities for professional development. They were each measured the same way, so we used the same verb. And then, at the end of the sentence, it gives you the scale that was used. The second sentence begins, a sample item is, and gives you the example. The third sentence states, all items were scored on a 5-point scale ranging from 1 never to 5 always. And you can see that the 1 is not always the same in each scale. Sometimes it's never, sometimes it's totally disagree. Sometimes it's something else. When you structure paragraphs in this way, the reader can very quickly and easily read over the paragraphs. They can very quickly and easily find the information that is different between the instruments that you're measuring, and they don't have to go searching for it. It becomes quite concise, and it saves the reader a lot of time in reading because the information is exactly where they expect to find it. Essentially, you've set up with your first paragraph with the structure that you're going to have. And then as long as only certain things change and you otherwise have to present all the same information, you need to make sure that all the information is presented in the same position. Let me give you some more examples of this. Yuval Harari has a lot of great examples of using parallelism in his book, Sapiens, so we're going to take a look at that. The very beginning, the introduction of Sapiens, the very first 4 paragraphs are a perfect example of parallelism. About 13.5 billion years ago, matter, energy, time, and space came into being in what is known as the Big Bang. The story of these fundamental features of our universe is called physics. About 300,000 years after their appearance, matter and energy started to coalesce into complex structures called atoms, which then combined into molecules. The story of atoms, molecules, and their interactions is called chemistry. About 3.8 billion years ago, on a planet called Earth, certain molecules combined to form particularly large and intricate structures called organisms. The story of organisms is called biology. About 70,000 years ago, organisms belonging to the species Homo sapiens started to form even more elaborate structures called cultures. The subsequent development of these human cultures is called history. Do you see the parallelism in these 4 introductory paragraphs? I have another example from Yuval Harari to show you how parallelism can be used once you set the structure of your information to maintain the same structure each time you want to explain that information. Here's the example. The first millennium BC witnessed the appearance of 3 potentially universal orders. The first universal order to appear was economic, the monetary order. The second universal order was political, the imperial order. The third universal order was religious, the order of universal religions such as Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam. Notice the order of the orders that he's presenting: economic, political, and religious. Each time he refers to these 3 orders, he's always going to refer to them starting with economic, then moving to political, and then moving to religious. Because that is the trend, that is the expectation that he has set in the reader's mind. He can no longer stray from that. As he goes on to give more information, he says, merchants, conquerors, and prophets. Exactly the same structure. The merchants were the economic order. The conquerors were the political order. And the prophets were the religious order. Merchants, conquerors, and prophets were the first people who managed to transcend the binary evolutionary division, us versus them, and to foresee the potential unity of humankind. For the merchants, the entire world was a single market, and all humans were potential customers. They tried to establish an economic order that would apply to all, everywhere. For the conquerors, the entire world was a single empire, and all humans were potential subjects. And for the prophets, the entire world held a single truth, and all humans were potential believers. They too tried to establish an order that would be applicable for everyone, everywhere. Notice how parallelism can be used to emphasize certain parts of the sentence. Here, our eyes are drawn to what is different between the sentences. It's about a market and customers. Then it's about an empire and subjects. Then it's about a single truth and believers. We don't have to focus so much attention on the preparatory work in the sentence, the parallel part. For the merchants, the entire world was. For the conquerors, the entire world was. For the prophets, the entire world held. Because of that repetition, we feel comfortable reading through this paragraph very quickly and pulling out the bits of information that are especially relevant, that we especially need to focus on. We don't have to focus equally on all parts of the sentence because some parts of the sentence are so familiar to us. That's what parallelism can do for your writing. It can make it much easier for your reader to process and understand, much easier for your reader to get through in one reading. Now, the one thing to remember about parallelism, as you try to apply it in your own writing, is you can never overdo it. Apply it everywhere. There will never be a moment where you say, oh, I could apply parallelism here in this sentence, but I have a reason not to do that. There's essentially never a reason not to apply parallelism. You will always change sentences to make them more parallel, not less.